Ooh-wee, ladies and gents. Lecture 4 is now in the books and ready to go. That, my friends, was certainly a marathon, definitely not a sprint. I don't know what it was about the start to this semester, but it seemed to take 4 months to get the school off the ground. On a positive note, we are no longer causing gridlock around the school during dismissal and morning lineup. So things do have a sign of getting a little bit better. So I hope it's that way for you guys as well. So welcome to the second set of lectures. This is going to be lecture 4, 5, and 6. In this particular lecture, and then in the next one, we're going to be covering different action research designs and giving you different ideas of how you're actually going to build out the ideas that you've accumulated in section number 1. This lecture is absolutely going to focus on qualitative methods. So we're going to take a look at that, and then in lecture number 5, we'll hit up the quantitative side of your data, and then we'll wrap it up with a little IRB. And if you don't know what IRB is, you'll find out in lecture number 6. In the meantime, I hope you guys do enjoy this next set of lectures. Oh, that's right, the picture. Gotta do the picture. Yes, that is my little girl. I don't know exactly where it is, but it definitely reminded me of an old school downtown. I believe that this was somewhere in Canada. Anyway, guys, I hope you're doing awesome. I hope you're doing terrific. I hope to see you guys very soon in our next live meet. But in the meantime, here is lecture number 4. As we transition from the theoretical of section 1, laying the groundwork and the foundation in section 1, to now getting very, very practical in your research going forward, one of the things that I'd like to bring up early on is the fact that assessment is very much a part of the research that we're going to be doing. Yes, the assessment will look slightly different than what you would typically find in a DOE classroom, or in any classroom for that matter. However, there is room, or there will be room, in order to use classroom assessment in order to understand your research just a little bit better. So these 3 questions are what I like to call primer questions. Let's take any one of these here. How about that last one? It's underlined, so I guess it's important, right? Can you see any of these ways applying to your data collection ideas, to the hypotheses that you created? So as you begin to answer these questions, you're really going to begin to apply whatever assessment you think you may need in order to answer, or I should say, in order to prove or disprove your hypotheses. What I suggest is take a quick little look, 30 seconds tops, and see if you could answer at least 1 or 2 of these questions. So as you can see, tonight's lecture is pretty much completely focused on not only the research design, but specifically qualitative research. And we'll walk through some of the founding ideas. But then more importantly for us as practical researchers is we're going to begin looking at the tools that are associated with qualitative measurement. I think I'll say it again later on in the lecture, but I'll say it again now just because it's early on and you're still kind of listening to me. Remember, qualitative and quantitative research has nothing to do with the intervention. It has to do with the way that you analyze the data that you're collecting. So in this case, in order to collect qualitative data, we're going to run through a host of options for you, a menu, if you will, in order to not just select the tools, but also create the tools that you will use in your data collection technique. So before we get going here real quick, let's look at the very, very big picture, the macro, if you will. Section 1, the information has now been delivered, and hopefully you are hard at work writing Section 1 as you hear this. In the next set of lectures, we are going to be talking about the design of your coming research project. As mentioned, we will be looking at qualitative research today. In the next lecture, we'll be looking at quantitative research, and then as we go forward, the lectures after that, lectures after 4 and 5 for qualitative and quantitative, we'll look at IRB approval, calendar creation, and then finally we got our eye on the research launch date. So all that is kind of coming, and that's where we are in the big picture. So our bathing suits are on. It's a nice warm day, so it is time to jump into the deep end of the pool. Let's talk about some research designs. I'd like to dedicate the next few minutes and the next several slides in order to give you information, or better put, a visual representation of how to build your research methodology. In many ways, your chosen methodology or your chosen research design is very much going to dictate how your research unfolds itself. So I'd like to spend some time on it early in this building process to make sure that you really understand what it is that you want your research to kind of look like. As part of that, last bullet point in red is that your research design and understanding your research design really is something that's going to be determined fairly early on, and certainly before you begin collecting data. So let's take a look at some of those early ideas in research design. Primer question page, and don't think too much about it, just say it out loud. What is your independent variable? How about your dependent variable? We did it in lecture 3, so if you don't automatically know what your independent variable is, then you should probably not necessarily go back right now, but start thinking, what is an independent variable, and more importantly, what are some of its parts? Your dependent variable, what it hopes to measure. You have any idea on those? Good job. Let's do a couple of review slides here. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because we've seen these already. This is the second time that you're looking at this slide, and it gives you some idea of what an independent and dependent variable is. I will say before switching the page that in your research questions, anything after the word by is most likely going to be your independent variable. Also, please check your hypotheses because that will also indicate what your independent variable is, and to some degree will also begin to indicate what your measure is, what your dependent variables are. Second review slide here, we have the intervention group and the control group. So your intervention group is going to be the group that is exposed to your experimental instructional lessons or models. And it could be really any stakeholders. It could be students, administrators, parents, other teachers. Most likely, and for 99.9% of you, the stakeholders that participate in the intervention group are going to be students. On the other side of that is going to be your control group. And your control group are students, administrators, parents, most likely students, that participate in typical DOE instruction, whatever that means for your particular professional world. So again, intervention group is the experimental group, and the control group is exposed to nothing but typical DOE. Let's get our first visual representation of the evening, and there will be several coming up in the very, very near future. So the first one is going to be your experimental group, way down there at the bottom, left-hand corner. And of course, the experimental group is going to be exposed to your intervention, whatever that means right now. Okay, whatever intervention you eventually propose for them, they are exposed to it. The control group, as mentioned earlier, is typical DOE instruction, whatever that means in your world, and the other side of that coin means that there is no intervention presented to them. So you've gotten 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7 slides of straight information. Now it's time to put it all together into a neat, nice, usable package for you. And in order to do that, I'd like to show you a new model, which will look a little bit different than the previous ones. But I'd like to put it to a hypothesis, which probably by this point in time, we should all be kind of familiar with. Students will read more pages during a 45-minute period if the lights are turned off. So, in the bottom where you see the visual part of the slide, intervention and no intervention, I'm going to replace those to better match the hypothesis. Ready? Here we go. As you can see, in the experimental group, the intervention, the IV, the treatment is, I'm going to turn those lights off. That's what the experimental group is going to be exposed to. But the control group, on the other side, is not exposed to lights on or lights off or anything else. What they're exposed to is, that's the word, traditional instruction. Whatever you would typically do for the students in the classroom, that is what your control group is going to be exposed to. Now, because I like to complicate things for us just a little bit, I'm going to add another level to this. I'm going to add a DV. I'm going to add a dependent variable. So, take it from the top. Here we go. The experimental group. Oh, you know what? I can get my little handy dandy pointer. Here we go. Here we go. So, the experimental group, which has the lights off during their reading period, is now going to be measured in one way, by the number of pages that they read. If I go back to the hypothesis way up at the top, I now have designed this particular sequence to measure whether more pages were read with the lights off or the lights off or lights on with the traditional instruction. From the bottom, the control group, who is going to receive whatever typical instruction they're usually exposed to, are going to also be measured by the number of pages that they read. So you can see some commonalities between the two groups. In this case, the two groups are actually going to be the same kids. The middle part is going to be two different stimuli, two different interventions, and then finally we're going to measure in the same exact way. Just taking a second to think about if I like the way that sounds. Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's the basic idea. However, if you look at the very, very top where it says pages read, wait a minute, that's only one dependent variable. What if there's more to testing the lights on, the lights off than just the number? Oh, for God's sakes, Perez, leave well enough alone. Why do we got to complicate things so much? I don't know, because we're teachers. That's what we do. We complicate things. So this part you know, the experimental group and the control group, you know who they are. They are people that are exposed to lights off and traditional lights on. This part you also know. I'm going to measure the number of pages that were being read with the lights off and with the lights on. Here's where we're going to complicate it though, because right now we only have one dependent variable, and frankly, if you have an experiment with only a single dependent variable, you're only getting a single assessment, a single measure. In this case, for our class, you're now going to have four measures. Okay, so the four measures that I wanted to show you, and these are just kind of off the top of my head. We'll get into some more specifics on these measures in just a little bit. But for now, in this visual representation, you can see that I'm going to test not only the lights on, lights off with the number of pages read, but I also want to do a running record. And for those of you that don't know what a running record is, it's It's a way that teachers will figure out whether a kid is reading fluently, comprehension, all kinds of good stuff with the running record. If you have more questions on that, www.google.com is your friend. So I am now measuring the number of pages read. I'm now doing a running record to measure comprehension and fluency. Maybe I'll throw an interview in there because I want to know how the kids felt about having the lights off. It's kind of like interesting, so I want to know what they thought about it. And finally, for that last dependent variable, I now am going to do something called a focus group, which we'll talk about in just a couple of slides. What's important to know for right now, para ahora mismito, is going to be that your 4 measures are going to determine whether the lights off or lights on produced a better reader or a more accurate reader. And we're going to begin to look at this experiment from 1, 2, 3, 4 different viewpoints. I'd like to point out something from the previous slide. You'll notice how each one of these has a little partner. Okay, whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. For those of you that are teaching math, look at it as an equation. Whatever I do to this side, whatever I expose them to as far as dependent variables on this side, I now need to expose them to the same thing on this side. The one thing that's different between the two sides is, good job, that middle piece here. Okay, that's the one part of the experiment that's going to be different from one side to the other. Okay, it is at points like this that I wish you were in front of me so I could actually take questions and kind of begin to figure out little snap assessment to figure out whether it was understood or not. But because you are not in front of me, I can't do that. So I'm going to assume that you got it. Threw in this little one add-on slide because I said a mouthful in that last slide. So 2 key takeaways that I want you to kind of focus on real quick before we move on to the next little piece here. Your experiment is going to have multiple participant groups. Again, for 99.9% of you, when I say multiple participant groups, I mean multiple student groups. The second bullet point that I would like for you to take away is you will be responsible for 4 independent variables that will measure 1 independent variable. It's at this point that students say, oh my God, Perez, 4 dependent variables, 4 measures. Fear not. They won't take too long to accomplish, and pretty much these are things that we would do within the class anyway. Remember the first slide of the evening after the title slide? I asked you the question, what are some of the assessments that you do in your classroom? That's why I asked you that question, because as we look towards defining what dependent variables you want to be using, how you want to measure the stimuli of your independent variable, there's no reason why you can't double up. If you're going to do it for the DOE, you might as well also do it for Perez. More on that in just a little while. I'm going to transition here into some more specific research designs, and well, let me not say any more because I'm going to talk about it on the next one. Designs. Not even sure what else to say. Different research designs. Here we go. Like all teachers, we always have several goals with any kind of information that we present. In this particular slide, what I would like to make explicit for us is the fact that you're going to be looking at several different choices in regard to many of the steps that you're going to be taking in your research. In this case, you're going to have a choice of different designs that you could implement within your study. How you go about doing it, which ones you choose, and some of those details are going to be the way that you individualize your research projects. But you have to be aware of the choice in order to kind of make that choice. I'll tell you one little quiet secret here, but don't tell anybody else. There really is no wrong answers at this point in the process. That's not true. There is only one wrong answer, and the one wrong answer is not making a choice at all. So, as long as you're able to choose something from the next set of slides that you think is going to work for you, and then begin to work at it through that avenue, you can't make a wrong choice. So, let's take a look at your first choice for the evening as far as research design. Let's take a look here at your first design choice, which is going to be a pretty classic design. I'm calling it the control pre-test post-test design, but you might have heard it under several different names. The truth is that this design has been around since time immemorial. It's probably one of the early research designs in the history of kind of bona fide research. Once they codified how research can and should be done. And basically the way that it works is that you have some sort of pretest, or what we in the DOE may call a baseline assessment, but something that gives you the current level of performance for a particular group of students or subjects, if you will. Once that pretest has been delivered, then there's some sort of treatment or intervention that has a set length of time, which comes right after that. And then, of course, you have your post-test, which is going to measure the growth between the baseline and the post-test assessment. I want to say a little bit more, but I'm going to jump to the next slide because I have a visual to show you, which I think might help. One last thing before I click the enter button here. On the last one, I've probably said it before, but I'm going to say it again because it's there and it's important. One of the things that you'll be measuring, not just in pretest, not just in design number one, but probably in all designs, is going to be something that has to do with either achievement, a behavior, or an attitude. It's one of those three things that you're looking to impact with your intervention and really with your teaching in general. Let's get back to design number one and what it looks like on the visual model. No, don't worry. I'm here. It's just I'm giving you a second or two to kind of take a look at this and see if you can kind of make heads or tails on your own here a little bit before I start yapping away. All right. That should be enough. So if you take a look at the first set of the first sequence there on the left-hand side labeled the control group. So of course a control group right in the middle has no intervention. Okay, no intervention. Whatever your typical DOE instruction is, or whatever happens on a normal everyday basis, that would be what happens here, right in the middle. But of course, because it's a pre-test and post-test design, you gotta have your pre-test, and then you gotta have your post-test. So that control group is simply measuring what would typically happen in your classroom according to the 4 pre-tests and the 4 post-tests. If you look at the experimental group design, okay, you'll notice that the 4 pre-tests are still there. Nothing has changed in that mode. And of course, the 4 post-tests are also there. So nothing has changed in that mode. The one thing that's changing, or I'm going to use the right word here, the one variable that's changing is going to be your intervention. Whatever your intervention is, probably not even sure right now, depending on where we are in the semester, but right now you might not even know. Just kind of taking a look at the way that the design is going to come together for you. The one variable that's changing from one sequence to the next is that intervention versus your traditional teaching. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that for those of you that will eventually choose this design in which to run your research project, probably going to pick some length of time, probably somewhere between 10 days, maybe 14 days, maybe 15 days for a 3-week research period. And you would have your set of time here, and then you would have your set of time on this side as well that are going to equal. That's because all the other variables, as much as you can, are going to be accounted for, except for that middle one, which is intervention versus not. That is visual design numero uno, number one. Why don't we go ahead and take a look at visual design number, yeah, that's right, number two. Design number two is called a simple time series. And once again, just like the first one, you may hear it referred to in several different ways, but I'm going to call it a time series. If you ask me, the design number two, the time series, gives you probably the most bang for buck that you could find in any one of these three different choices that you have. Not that it's always the best one for you and for what your goals are and for what you want to do, but as far as the ability to generate data for your later writing, this probably does the most effective job. So the difference between the design number one, the pre-test, post-test, and this one is that instead of having one long control and one long intervention, here you have a series of shorter interventions, or what we consider to be treatments, that are followed by a repeated measure. So it's almost like you're doing your interventions in a trial format, and typically you would go through 3 trial periods, but depending on how you design it, you may actually have more than 3 trials as part of your time series. Like last time, I'm going to say very little here, and I'll say a little more on the next slide when you could actually see the way that it looks in a visual format. So obviously, right off the bat, you can see that it looks, probably even feels a little bit different than the last one. And that's for a very obvious reason. The format and the sequence that you would take in order to complete this particular research format is going to be very different than the last one. If you take a look at the left-hand side, you'll see that the intervention is repeated 3 times, or what we would say in research terms as there's a three trial intervention. As part of each trial, you'll notice that the dependent variables are linked in a trial by trial format. If you don't like the word trial so much, which I do not, I happen to like the word week 1, week 2, and week 3, or whatever set length of time you have for that particular trial. Most teachers in your shoes that choose this visual design will choose to do about 2 weeks per trial. I'm a big fan of that 4 to 6 week research period, so that very much does work. If you'll notice, though, there is one thing that is glaringly missing that was very prominent in the last one. I can't flick back because then I'll lose my recording, and I'm already a minute and a half in, don't want to lose that. So I can't show it to you, but if you kind of visualize it in your head, you'll remember that there was a control side to that experimental sequence. Well, when you come here to the time series, there is no control. Now think about it like this: when you have a control, when you have a baseline, when you need to know how one stacks up against another one, in this case how the control stacks up against the intervention, you're using that control as a comparison. Well, take a look here. What's going to be your comparison? No, like seriously, like try to answer the question. Good. So your comparison is not going to come between a control and an experimental group. Your comparison is going to come between the different number of trials that you run with your class. It's kind of an interesting way of doing it, but on the other end, it's also fairly similar to the pretest and post-test in that you still have an intervention, you still have an independent variable, you still have your 4 dependent variables. So all that's in place. It's just a format that's changing slightly. Let's take a look at the third one, because I also happen to like the third one very, very much. In previous semesters, they say I say this word a little bit weird. The classes have said that. I say correlational. But I've been told that it's correlational, not correlational. I think I'm becoming more of a New Yorker every day. Design number 3 is called a correlational design. And in many ways, a correlational design gives you the most amount of flexibility for a type of intervention that may have different facets to it and different aspects to it that you would like to test within your research sequence. Here we go. Look at this. At face value, very, very similar to the time series, design number 3. So it is similar in the sense that it has the trials. And of course it has your 4 dependent variables. Can't get away from that, can we? So you have your trials and you have your dependent variables. But take a closer look at the intervention. The intervention has, in this case, 3 different versions of that same intervention. So I want to give you a practical example, even though I don't do this too often because I don't like to pen you guys into one idea. I'm going to do it here because I think it's actually quite helpful to explain the slide a little bit. I had a talented researcher, and she wanted to do an experiment that exposed students to different kinds of music during their independent math work. She wanted to know if it would help them become a little more effective. It was kind of like an achievement measure, which I had mentioned before. So version number 1 was the Mozart effect. She played a Mozart track. Version number 2 was an R&B track or tracks, and then number 3 was student choice track. So this is a perfect example because the intervention remains consistent. It's all about the music that's being given to students during their independent work period. The place where the different aspects, or the V1, V2, V3, the different versions come in, is obviously in the type of music that's being presented. If you just had a single type of music, you would use design number 2. Because she included the different genres of music, that's where the correlational design was much better for her than design number 2. I remember her thought process as she was doing it, and there was a lot of critical thinking involved in saying, well, which one is going to benefit me as a researcher the most? And that can't be dismissed or overlooked, because even though right now in choosing a visual design, it doesn't really require any work, from you right now, but it's setting you up for your data collection period, which probably is coming sooner rather than later. So let's try it now real quick. Actually, this is a little bit of a misleading slide because the truth is you're not really trying anything right now. I'm going to keep it short and sweet. The try it now is pick one. Just pick one of them. Kind of let it sit in your head for a little bit. Then answer the question, why did you choose this design? What advantages did, just off the top of my head, did design 2 have over design number 1? And it could be something as simple as, hey, you know what? It seemed cooler, it seemed easier, it seemed more simple. Those are all very legitimate reasons for choosing one of these. But I find that it's important as we go through the next step next steps, to have one kind of in your back pocket, and then let the slides that are forthcoming guide you a little bit further. Right now, you're not on the hook for anything, but you should have the idea placed firmly in your mind so that if you do need to change it, you begin to understand why you change it. I have one more slide before we change gears, and it's a caution slide. So this slide is actually a byproduct of way back in the day, the OG, when we used to actually meet in a classroom. Remember those days? So the slide came about because typically once I start getting into research design, I start to see a lot of worried faces, and this may or may not apply to you. Maybe you're cool as a cucumber, in which case, if you have no reservations, feel free to fast forward. But for some of you, these types of tasks and activities will create some sort of stress or some sort of indecision in your process right now. And the caution page is meant to serve as a kind of like as a check and to say, you know what, it's okay if things are fuzzy right now. Remember in lecture number 1, before we did the first three lectures in their totality, when you started in lecture number 1, I'm sure there were parts of it where you were like, dude, Perez, what is he thinking? But hopefully by the time you got to lecture number 3, it all kind of fell together for you. At least that was the idea and the intent. The same thing is happening here right now because we're in that second second set of lectures. So really, the design is the first lesson in the second set. So there will be that fuzziness and there will be that confusion. But like I said on the last slide, don't be shy to make that decision right now in your head, and then kind of go forward with it and use the slides to your advantage with that idea already firmly in place in your head. So it is a caution slide, but let's throw caution to the wind and move on. My daughter says, you have two things that you do that are really irritating. I said, yes, daughter, what are those? She says, first, when you lecture, you laugh at your own jokes. And she says, number 2, why do you gotta be so dramatic over everything? Well, first off, because, I don't know, I like my own jokes. I think that they're funny, so I laugh at them. Besides, there's no one else in the room, so what am I supposed to do? And number 2, I'm dramatic, and that I'm aware of. I am overly dramatic on these little quote-unquote podcasts or lectures. But think about it. If I was boring and monotone, you wouldn't listen to half of the stuff that I present. So you know what? It's okay to be a little bit dramatic. Speaking of drama, qualitative methodologies. Here we go. So let's start this building process here for discovering what, how, when, where, and why qualitative research is going to work for you. So as we begin putting this process together, one of the things that you have to internalize and that you have to understand very, very early on is that as we begin taking data, whether it's qualitative like now or quantitative in the next lecture, the overriding question that you have to ask yourself at all possible moments is what I'm doing going to prove or disprove my hypothesis? Let's do a couple more foundation slides here before we really kick off the idea of purely qualitative research. One of the things I like to mention, and sometimes it can be a source of confusion, so I like to say it explicitly. When we talk about an intervention, or when we talk about the research design. We're not referring to qualitative or quantitative research designs. What we're essentially saying is that we're going to measure either in a qualitative or quantitative way, but the actual intervention itself kind of just is. The research design just is. The way that you measure success or the way that you measure progress within a research design is either through qualitative or quantitative. Obviously, right now we're going to be talking about some qualitative tools in the next coming slides. So I had mentioned these three things a little bit earlier in this lecture, and I probably mentioned it somewhere in lectures 1 through 3 at some point, but I don't recall. So I'm going to spend just a minute or so talking about this right here in case you missed it or in case I missed it. The idea behind qualitative and quantitative data collection is that you're measuring some sort of progress. You're measuring hopefully what is some sort of success, either in the academic world, the behavioral world, or the attitudinal world. So the first one's easy. Academics is easy. How much knowledge did the kid gain? How many skills? How many strategies was the student able to absorb and use? It could be something very practical, like in some sort of running record or fluency assessment. How many words gained, or what was the accuracy level of the reading? You're measuring something in the academic world. Behaviors is also pretty straightforward. You could be measuring both positive behaviors or negative behaviors. We can change that to say on-task behaviors or off-task behaviors. We can measure the frequency, the duration, and we'll talk about some of these things later on. But again, so you have that idea in the back of your mind. So behaviors are also pretty straightforward to understand. An attitude, though, measuring an attitude can be a little bit tricky. An attitude is basically the way that a student or a participant feels about something in your research sequence. In this case, and 99% of the time for action research, the attitude that you're looking to measure is how did the student feel about your intervention, or how did the student feel about your control lessons. So that's basically the type of attitude that we're looking to take data on. If you look at the four dependent variables that are part of your thesis, the combination of how you measure academics, behavior, and attitudes is very much going to determine whether your thesis is proven or disproven. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go through some of these qualitative ideas, which are coming up right now. So qualitative data in a nutshell. This is kind of what it looks like. Obviously, they've written books, and all kinds of writing has been produced on what qualitative research is. But for me, to you, this is the part that I need you to understand, is the fact that you as a researcher are going to begin to look for patterns in the behaviors, in the attitudes, in the academics. What do those patterns tell you about the stimuli, the intervention that's being presented? We're eventually going to call these patterns a particular trend. These trends are the basis of your data. And in fact, in many ways, the data that you collect is all based off a particular trend. We're going to talk a lot more about this as we get into the analysis section of your thesis, which probably won't be for several lectures from now. But for now, the underlying idea that I need you to take with you as I change this slide is the fact that you're looking for patterns in qualitative research. You're looking for patterns that may otherwise go overlooked. If you want to hear it in research terms, we could say that we are looking for different phenomenon or a different phenomena as a singular within the patterns that you're looking for in your qualitative data. Just as a sidebar, when you hear me take like a deep breath, for example, like at the very end of the last slide, it probably means that I trimmed out a whole bunch of my talking that came with that slide, which I just simply didn't present to you. In that other slide, I spoke for almost 3 minutes more, and I tend to do that sometimes when I really want to make sure that you understand what I'm saying. So I go a little bit overboard, but I'm mindful of it, so I kind of trim it back later on. But just so you can kind of hear what's going on from a presenter point of view. In this particular slide, I want to link the idea of a trend, like a pattern, which we spoke about in the last slide, with, well, great, how do I find that trend, and where does the data come from in order to make that trend even accessible to us as researchers? So there are 4 bullet points at the bottom, and in essence, what's going to happen with these 4 bullet points is that these are going to be your data. For example, an observational note, or a transcript, a collection of some sort, a narration from a recording, from a tape recording. Those very much become your data. From the observational notes, you're now going to look for the patterns and the trends which we spoke about in the last slide. Of course, it means that if you don't have a transcript or a collection or observational notes or anecdotal records, then you have no data and you have nothing to base your research on. So it becomes paramount to understand that the data that you're creating is in many ways, not in many ways, in every way, created by you, the researcher, and that is what your trends are going to be based off of. In the next set of slides, we're going to be talking about the actual tools that you would use in order to accumulate the data that we just spoke about. Let's take a look there. Let's take a look at some qualitative tools, why don't we? Yes, it is very much about a choice of qualitative tools in bright red letters right at the very beginning. Remember, with the research design, I said to you, you're going to have a choice of 3 different research designs, and whichever you choose is cool with me. As long as you have a valid reason for choosing it, it works for me. Well, it's the same thing with your tool selection. Your tool selection is also going to be a choice, and I'm going to present to you some of your different choices. You are going to choose 2 out of the ones that I present. I'm sure I have a slide on that later on, but I'll say it here because it comes to mind. And this is very much not an exhaustive list. I mean, I chose 4 tools that have worked for me and have worked for the students that I've worked with over the years. But for those intrepid researchers out there who are listening to this, your textbook, Google or the internet, has more features and certainly different tools that you can implement and use. So if you are so inclined, by all means, you don't necessarily have to use one of the tools that I present. But for 99.99% of you, you will choose two of the following tools. So here we go with tool number 1, which is in many ways a very, very classic qualitative research tool, and that is simple observation. And I know that seems intuitive now, yeah, of course, you observe and, you get your qualitative data. But it's somewhat of a lost art for us as teachers, only because we're so engaged in what it is that we're doing in the classroom. And even when we're not 100% engaged with the children, because of, there's times out there where, we're doing other stuff in the classroom. We're not really observing students. So it may seem intuitive, but for this particular slide, I'm gonna say that this is your primary tool as a researcher. Now, the one thing that I'd like to explore just a little bit further is that you know how it is when you walk into a classroom. There's dozens and dozens of different interactions and an infinite amount of variables that are taking place in a classroom of 30 students or so. So because of that organized chaos to some degree, I'd like to talk a little bit more about what it means to be a qualitative researcher that's observing a particular population. And I want to talk about 3 different vantage points that you could explore as part of your observation. Those are going to be a large group spectator, active observer, and then finally a full participant. Let's talk about those real quick. So the first 2 types of observations that you can certainly key in on is the idea of a non-targeted observation and a targeted observation. They serve very, very different purposes, and many times when I am observing a class, not so much for research, but just for other roles that I play within my school, I like to use these in tandem. And the non-targeted observation basically says that you're going to walk into a classroom and you're going to observe what it is that's happening without having any preconceived ideas of what it is that you're looking for. So if I would put myself in the scenario of you, the researcher, I would walk into a classroom, or if virtual learning is still taking place, you would walk into your virtual classroom, and you would begin to take notes on different things that you're seeing that you kind of find interesting. What you're looking for is something that the students are doing that strikes a chord with you, but also you see it happening kind of maybe multiple times. And once you have that in your back pocket, at a future time, you would come back with a targeted observation. So now you're looking for a specific behavior, a specific attitude, or academic pattern, and now you're going to look more carefully at that particular pattern in order to examine and explore that trend just a little further. I happen to like non-targeted before targeted observation because I feel that non-targeted is a little bit more wide spectrum and I could gather more information, whereas once I get to that targeted stage, because I'm looking for something specific, then my goals are also very narrow in focus. Once you've kind of done that tandem to some degree, then comes the vantage point, which I spoke about in the last slide, and how you're going to look at those students in your classroom. Let's take a look at those. Once again, linking the last slide, you've now gone to your targeted observation. You found a particular, behavior that you want to look at. So now you would begin this little sequence here, which is what your textbook calls the observational lens. In the large group spectator, what you're essentially doing is you're a passive fly on the wall. You're sitting back and you're taking a look at the large picture. Wait, as it relates to the pattern which you spotted from the slide before. If you were just to walk into a classroom and be a large group spectator, not looking for anything in specific, then basically you would be going to what I would consider to be step number 1, which is a non-targeted observation. This one says, no, you are going in as a large group spectator, but you want to examine and look at a particular pattern a little more closely in order to investigate that pattern. Once you've had a chance to take a look at the entire group and the dynamics within that group, then you can move a little bit closer to perhaps a smaller group of students, and you could begin to move through them as an active observer at a much more narrow focus. So whereas large group spectator is a very wide angle lens, the active observer now begins to look for details within those smaller little learning environments that take place within your classroom. What many researchers call this is a participant's eye view. So you're getting down at their level, but maybe not necessarily interacting with them just yet. That's because I have one more to show you on the next slide. So one of the cool things about qualitative research is that unlike quantitative research, which we'll talk about next time, unlike that process, here you could actually really kind of get into what it is that you're looking for and begin to interact with the students around you. But there's a much more powerful aspect to a full participant, which I want to express to you before we move on to the next slide here, and that is the simple fact that as a full participant, you very much can make inquiries, you could ask questions, or like that last bullet point says, you could actually facilitate a situation where you can now begin to look for something that you wanted to find, but maybe the students weren't necessarily being exposed to that stimuli at that very moment. So you create the situation for them where now that small group that you're interacting with is now faced with a situation that will help you understand your data just a little bit further. I'm gonna leave it there because I think it's pretty self-explanatory, and in many ways, teachers are very good at being full participants. We're always working with small groups and in one-to-one scenarios. But it gives you another choice and another level of understanding when it comes to the type of observations that you're going to be doing for your thesis, if you choose to use observation. Because remember, it's all about the choices. Let's look at tool number 2. So I've always been a big fan of the interview. Oh, by the way, this is tool number 2. I've always been a big fan of the interview process. I find that you tend to gain a lot of information very, very quickly by asking kind of the right questions from a interviewee, and because I like interacting with people, for me this was an enjoyable tool to use whenever I could. A couple of ideas here on the interview. You could obviously make it either formal or conversational. I happen to be a conversational type of guy, so I like talking to anybody who I happen to be to interviewing. It is very much recommended that you have mostly open-ended questions. For those of you that are not familiar with that type of question, it means that it's a question that has many right answers. It tends to be more of an opinion question as opposed to a factual question. A close-ended question would be like, I don't know, who's the first president of the United States? There's only one right answer. It's George Washington. But when you ask an open-ended question and you say, was George Washington's presidency a success? There are many different answers to that, and you will find that students will respond obviously in greater length with the open-ended questions. Feel free to have follow-up questions. In fact, I would think that by the time you by the time that you get towards your interview process, that you will have several questions that you could follow up with, or you can kind of create them as you go along. But it is a way to dig deeper into what it is that the student is trying to express to you. I don't have it here, but I will mention it that another way of doing that, and it kind of works in all aspects of life, is that when someone stops talking, if you just don't talk right afterwards, if you just kind of pause, we call that a pregnant pause, meaning that you let the pause sit for a little while, maybe even into, kind of getting into the uncomfortable or awkward silence. Most people will feel the need will feel the need to fill the void of silence, and therefore will respond with further information. A lot of times, that further information, they will add new and novel stuff that you didn't hear about in the first answer. You could also try it with your significant other. My wife says that to me all the time, right? She goes like, we'll be talking about something, and she'll be like, "Are you doing that pregnant pause thing again?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I am doing that pregnant pause because I want a little bit more in order to understand, the answer a little bit better." Another good tip is that very last one, and that is that you should definitely be listening more than you talk during the interview. Went on a little bit longer than I wanted to, but at the very, very top, some of you should be wondering, "Perez, why do you have an interview and a questionnaire on the same slide?" There's a very simple answer for that, and that is because a questionnaire is simply an interview that's on paper. You're basically asking a question, and you're asking the interviewee or the person answering the questionnaire to fill in their answer, hopefully in some sort of narrative. Questionnaire and a survey should never be confused. A questionnaire is a qualitative tool, and a survey is a quantitative tool. There's always a handful of students in your boat that get those confused. We'll see how it is this semester. Let's move on to tool number 3. Tool number 3 is something called a focus group. And focus groups are a great tool to use when you want to interview more than one person at a time, for the express purpose of getting them to talk about whatever it is that you kind of want them to talk about. I'm going to assume that for most of you, the topics or the kind of like the scenarios that you're going to present to your focus group, if you choose to use this particular tool, is going to very much center around your intervention and around your, what it is that you did as part of the intervention process, in order to get them to talk about the intervention and see what did they like, what did they dislike, what did they find to be effective, what did they find to be maybe ineffective. That's the beauty of having that focus group, is in a lot of ways you're not constantly putting in the stimuli as you would with the interview. Instead, what you're doing is you're throwing something into the ring, and letting them talk about the talk about what it is that you needed to gain from them as a researcher. I will say a focus group, if done correctly, will produce extraordinary amounts of information in a very, very short amount of time. For that reason, taping a focus group is a very legitimate practice. It's almost, I would say, near impossible to take proper notes. On a focus group. There's just too much being said. And what I also like about the focus group is a lot of times all it really requires is one focus group to get all the needed data for your qualitative research. So, the fact that you could generate a lot of data in a very short amount of time actually may streamline your process. One last note about recording there, and we'll talk more about it. I have a particular lecture that we talk about some of the things that you can and cannot do as part of your research. So we'll talk more about it there. But yeah, it's a perfectly legitimate practice that you can record your focus groups in order to make sure that you squeeze out as much data as you possibly can. Let's take a look at the fourth one, because the fourth one's kind of interesting. Last one is titled Artifact Collection, tool number 4. Last tool here, Artifact Collection. So an artifact is something from your research environment that you're going to be taking and pulling out of that environment and presenting it to the reader in order to teach them something. But that gets a little bit tricky, because a lot of times young researchers will say, okay, fine, I'm going to pull a test out of the environment, and I'm going to grade the test. No, it doesn't work that way. You're going to grade that test, and you're going to provide a numerical value for that test. Therefore, it's a quantitative measure. But if you're able to take something that we could learn from as researchers, or as the person reading the researchers, from that environment in order to learn something, that is a great tool. I'll give you a good example of using that tool in the real world. There was a talented researcher I had several years ago, and he was looking at the way that students focus through a test, regular examination, regular Friday afternoon test. And what he did was he took the scrap paper from the math test, and he kind of began to describe how the more intricate the drawings and the doodles were on that scrap paper, the worse the score would be. So in that case, his artifact collection was the scrap paper and was the doodles that the students were actually doing. I don't know if it worked out 100% for him, but I thought that the idea was kind of interesting and cool. And I'm a sucker for interesting ideas, so I kind of went with it. So student work, pictures, just not of the kids, because you don't know who has consent and who does. I mean, I'm sure you do, but it's just better not. Again, art and drawings or any kind of teacher work would certainly be part of artifact collection. Give it, if you're interested, give it a try. It's kind of a gray area of collecting qualitative data, but it has the potential to be really, really cool. One last note, and again, this is an ethical consideration, which we'll talk about again. You should be asking permission for any kind of artifact collection that you're taking from the environment. This is especially true if you're an observer, a student teacher, as opposed to a fellow that it's kind of like your classroom. But you really shouldn't be taking anything that doesn't belong to you. That's not research. That's not data collection. That's called stealing. So even from a kid, and kids are usually pretty cool. You'll ask you'll ask the student if you could take a picture of their work from their notebook. I would say 9 out of 10 times they're going to say that it's pretty fine. For your consideration, one more slide. I kind of hinted this at the very beginning of this sequence, but I'm actually glad that there's a slide on it here, so we can talk about it just a little further. Where does your data come from? Well, your data comes from your notes. And I know this is going to seem completely foreign, but the more intricate, the more detailed your notes are, the easier your work becomes later on when you're writing your later sections. That's because eventually we're going to have to analyze and interpret these notes. If you're trying to analyze something that doesn't exist, right? If you don't have notes and you don't have data, the task is going to suck, and it's going to force you to make up stuff. This is one of those cases where it's actually easier to do the work than to start making up things that are going to be a part of your qualitative research. I'm not a dummy. I know that it's out there. I know that there's going to be a percentage of people that do kind of, to some degree fabricate their impressions of what it is that they're doing here. But what I notice is that if you're able to actually go through the process and take your notes, what I'm going to teach you is a way to extract the writing, the data from your notes and put it right into your later sections. So it's almost like you're not wasting time by writing the notes. You're actually beginning the writing process for sections, for section whatever it is, 3 and 4. You're actually getting a head start on it. And I had one student comment to me several semesters ago and say, you know what? I followed what it is that you were saying, and I found that I had almost written like 60 to 70% of a particular section that's coming up. And he's like, man, it kind of made the work easy. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I kind of wish more people would listen to it. But I'll leave that up to you. On another note, I'm calling it a night. I noticed that when I tend to ramble a little bit and when I begin to slur my words, it is time for me to quit. It is 9:30 at night and I am getting hungry. So I'm going to get some calories in me. Ladies, gentlemen, I bid you peace. I will see you in the next subheading probably tomorrow. All right, everybody, here we go. We have a couple of slides to do before we call this lecture a wrap. Let's do them really quickly and begin to talk about how we're going to create these qualitative tools and make some choices. Choices are good. Basically, you have 4 tools that you're going to choose from here, right? That was the point of the earlier slides in this lecture. In reality, there is no single kind of right way of choosing a data collection tool, and that goes both for qualitative and then next lecture, which will be quantitative. So there is no right way that I could say, hey, look, these are the different steps that you're going to do in order to choose the right tool. Really, what's going to dictate or determine what tool you're going to be using is your ability to think critically about what type of data you really want to collect. Take a look at bullet point number 2 there. One of the things that I recommend to students, especially in your position where you're working full time and you're kind of, this is a part of what you do, not the only thing that you do, is your data tools should really be dictated to some degree by how easy they are to use for you. Or like the bullet point number 3 says there, your ability to complete the needed actions or the needed requirements of that particular tool. To that degree, if you are able to combine different types of data collection actions or tools that are part of your classroom routines anyway, I know you can't see it, but I'm giving you 2 thumbs up, because that ability to combine, 2 things, kind of kill 2 birds with that single stone, in many ways is going to dictate how easy your research is to kind of deliver and put together. So you have that ease of use, the ability to complete the needed requirements, and then finally whatever you can combine with your classroom routines. Even though obviously for this particular year our classroom routines are somewhat wonky, to say the least. Well, now that I say that, I mean, maybe even there are data collections that you could do online or through your virtual classes. It's interesting. I never thought about that, but I don't see why that wouldn't work. Either way, you have a lot of different decisions to make, and in reality, there really is no bad decisions right now. As long as they work for you, they are good choices. We'll do one more quick slide here before we turn the page and get to a try it now. What are going to be your qualitative responsibilities? In reality, over the course of this research period, you can expect to generate about 2 to 3 pages of qualitative notes. And of course, these will be collected among two qualitative tools, two out of the four that you're going to be choosing. Now, I will say this here, and I'll probably say it again later on, but I will not collect these 2 to 3 pages of qualitative data. So that's not something that I'm going to necessarily see unless you choose to share it with me. But remember what I said earlier. If you're able to write those 2-3 pages during the data collection, meaning that as you're collecting your qualitative data, later on when you go to write that analysis and you write that interpretation, that writing becomes very, very easy to produce, to the point where you'll even be kind of copying and pasting much of those 2 or 3 type pages right into your thesis. So it is not more work. In many ways, it makes your work a little bit easier. I'm gonna wrap that up, and let's take a look at a quick try it now. Not just a regular try it now. That's right, extended version. Boom, boom. So as you get into the try it now, one of the things that I often recommend for my students is that you kind of have an idea of what it is that you want to go with as you get into the try it now before you actually begin to give it a shot. So in this case, you had a choice of four qualitative tools, right, or data collection tools. What I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to pick 2 that you think would kind of work for you and for your research. And once you have that decision made, the next couple slides are going to walk you through a couple of different exercises or activities for you in order to make the creation of those tools just a little bit easier. Let's take a look on the next slide and jump right in here. Start off this sequence with the observation. And if you don't know all about the observation, I would like for you to be kind and rewind and look at some of the slides that I have on the tool called the observation. For now, if you're ready to try it now and you think that observation is going to be a tool that you're going to be using in your data collection, some of the things that you could do, especially initially with setting up the tool, are these 3 bullet points. So for example, let's say you do want to do the observation. Go ahead and set up that observational plan. I know, even if it's not going to be, scripted, to the 100, come up with a couple of different ideas that you think you may want to see within your observations. And look at the last bullet point there. Remember we spoke about academic behavior and attitudinal trends. Kind of been talking about those 3 things for quite a while now. At least that's what it seems to me. Come up with a couple of different things that you would like to look for in your students' academic world that are more or less part of your intervention. On the other end, is there a behavior that you could look for? Try to set up some of these ideas within your observational framework in order to help you that once you do get into that scenario where you are taking notes and you are kind of collecting data, you're being the most efficient data collector that you can be because you've done some of the legwork to begin with. Let's say an observation's not for you. Try the next one. Doing the legwork, laying the groundwork, the foundation. Can't think of any more cliches, but if I do, I will mention them at the end of this slide because the try it now in this one has to do with the interview. So what's the type of legwork that you could do for the interview process? Well, the most obvious and the most basic one is that you're going to generate a list of questions that you're going to be asking the interviewee. As part of that, if you want to come up with any follow-up questions or any follow-up topics that you may want to look at or subtopics that you may want to look at, all these things will make your actual interview go a lot smoother if you have them kind of prepared. So if interview is for you, go ahead and give that a shot. Try it now. If you like the focus group, some of the things that you could do before getting into that group situation is going to be to list all the members that you may want to have participating in that group. Once you do have that list of members, conversation starters, questions, scenarios, different ideas that you want to glean from that focus group is something that you could already bring into that session with you. Even though it's not written here, as part of that is make sure that your recording device is very clear, and if you are going to be recording the focus group, that you have that hardware available so that you don't get stuck at the time. I'm not sure exactly how much legwork the artifact collection really truly needs. Honestly, it's probably just a matter of listing a couple of ideas of different things that you may want to collect at the time of data collection. So I'm not going to spend any real time on this. How about a little slide of clarity? Here we go. Well, maybe we'll skip the slide of clarity just for today and instead provide some words of encouragement. I know if you listen to the first slide that things have been pretty hard in our schools. Maybe not hard. Let's call it they've been a little challenging to get back into the routine of things. So things have been probably a little bit difficult for all of us in the class. Just a couple of words of encouragement. Section number 2 is a very short section. I think it's only 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 pages, so it's not a ton of writing. And then after you turn in your section number 2, your assignments very much cool down for a good 4 to 5 weeks, and that's when you'll get down and start collecting some data. But collecting data is going to be something that you do in your classroom, and it should be a part of your everyday routine. So as far as the work that's to be completed, that will come down. So stick with it, guys. I know I say it a lot, but it definitely it definitely bears repeating sometime. If you get stuck, if you're not sure, if you're unclear about something, just shoot me an email. It's I've spoken to dozens of students this semester, and if you're not one of them and you do need help, please go ahead and reach out. Good luck, guys, and I will catch you in lecture number 5.